Today's lesson comes from section 11.1. It's day 2 of simplifying radical expressions with multiplication. Our objective today is to simplify radical expressions by multiplying. So some things you want to keep in mind while you're doing this is that we're still looking for pairs, we're still multiplying numbers inside the radical, and we're still multiplying numbers outside the radical. All the same rules that we were working on yesterday still apply. Okay, so let's start with some level 1 questions. Our first problem is the square root of 5 times the square root of 6. So let's go through, let's multiply the numbers outside the radical, which are 1 and 1, because those are invisible numbers outside. So 1 times 1 is 1. Write our radical. Inside the radical, we have 5 times 6, which is 30. And we're going to go ahead and check and see if 30 can be broken down further. It goes into 6 and 5. 6 goes into 3 and 2. Since all of our stems are now prime and there aren't any pairs, that means the radical 30 is as simplified as it gets. So our final answer is 1 radical 30. It's perfectly okay if you don't write the 1 and you just write the square root of 30. Either way is okay. So a problem for you to try like that, problem 1a would be the square root of 3 times the square root of 5. Okay. Problem number 2. Still a level 1 question. The square root of 8 times the square root of 8. Again, we multiply the numbers outside. We have 1 times 1, just 1. I'm not even going to go ahead and write that. Multiply the numbers inside. We have 8 times 8, and those stay underneath the radical. 8 times 8 is 64. So right now I have the square root of 64, which we know from yesterday's lesson that the square root of 64 is in fact 8. So the radical 8 times radical 8 is just 8. A problem for you to try like that. Let's do the square root of 6 times the square root of 6. Okay. And last question from level 1, problem number 3. Let's do the square root of 2 times the square root of 14. Multiply the numbers outside. 1 times 1 is 1. Don't need to write the 1 outside the radical. And then multiply the numbers inside the radical. 2 times 14 is 28. So we're going to go ahead and break down that 28. 28 breaks down into 7 and 4. 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. These are skills that we learned in yesterday's lesson. We'll pair up the 2's. If you're struggling with this, make sure you refer back to 11.1 day 1. Pair up the 2's, we pull them out. So outside the radical, we write 1, 2 for those pairs. And inside the radical, we have that lonely little 7. He stays home, doesn't get to go out on a date. So our final answer for number 3 is 2 radical 7. And example 3a for you to try. Let's do radical 3 times radical 8. And when you're finished with that, we're going to step it up a notch and move to our level 2 questions. So level 2 gets a little bit harder. Let's go ahead and do number 4, the square root of 2 times 5 radical 14. Okay, if you notice, the only thing that's harder about it is that we actually have a coefficient on the second radical. So we're going to go ahead and multiply the numbers outside the radical. Invisible 1 times that 5. There should be a 1 there. Okay. 1 times 5 is 5. And inside the radical, we have 2 times 14, which is 28. Break down the 28. Looks familiar, just like the problem from up above. 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. Pair up the 2's. Now here's what's different about this one is that we actually have to multiply those 2's by the 5. So outside the radical we have a 5. And now we have 1, 2 for the pair of 2's. And then inside the radical we have that poor lonely 7 still left home alone. And if you remember from yesterday's lesson, we go ahead and multiply all those numbers outside. So we have 5 times 2 gives us 10 radical 7 as our final answer. 4a for you to try. Let's do the square root of 3 times 2 radical 21. Okay. And number 5. Let's do 3 radical 7 times negative 4 radical 28. Now, this is the same exact type of problem, exactly what we were doing before. The only thing that's different is that it's in parentheses. It's still multiplication, we're still doing the same thing. So don't let the parentheses trick you all of a sudden. Okay? Multiply the numbers outside. 3 times negative 4 gives us negative 12. Multiply the numbers inside. 7 times 28 gives us 196. Now this one's a little bit unique because we notice that we have a perfect square here. So we have negative 12 times the square root of 196 is 14. And negative 12 times 14 is negative 168. And so our final answer for number 5 is negative 168. Problem like that for you to try before we move on to level 3 is 2 radical 5 times negative 3 radical 20. And when you're finished with that one, you can move on to level 3 questions. We're going to put them in black because they're black belt questions. They're the toughest ones we'll see all day. There's only 2 of them, and I'm going to actually do the 2 problems first and then give you one example to try on your own from the 2 because the 2 are very similar. So, number 6, let's do negative 3 radical 20 times negative 2 radical 15. We'll start by multiplying the numbers outside. Negative 3 times negative 2 is positive 6. And then underneath the radical, we want to do 20 times 15. Now, 20 times 15 might not come natural to you. Okay? So anytime you're multiplying 2 numbers and you don't know what it is right off the top of your head, if they're too big, just go ahead and write down those 2 numbers underneath the radical. Then break each one of those down separately and see if you can find any pairs, because you're allowed to pair up any numbers underneath the radical with each other. So let's break down that 20. It goes into 4 and 5. 4 goes into 2 and 2. And then 15 breaks down into 5 and 3. And what we see here is there's actually 2 pairs. There's a pair of 2s. And there's a pair of 5s. It's perfectly okay to pair up those 5s with each other because it's all multiplication. And they're all underneath the radical. So then I'm going to have on the outside, I have my 6 from the original problem. I have a 2 from my 2s. And then I also have a 5 from my 5s. And inside, left at home, I have this poor lonely little 3. He gets left underneath the radical. Multiply all those numbers outside. So 6 times 2 is 12, times 5 is 60, and then in at home, I have a 3. So my final answer is 60 radical 3. Let's do one more like that, and then I'll give you an example one for you to try, and we'll be all done. So 2 radical 14 times negative 3 radical 35. Again, same thing with the other ones. Multiply the numbers outside. So 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Multiply those numbers inside. And 14 times 35. Too big for me to try and multiply in my head, so I'm just going to go ahead and write 14 times 35 underneath the radical and break them each down separately. 14 breaks into 2 and 7. 35 breaks into 5 and 7. And now all my numbers are prime, and I'm noticing I have a pair of 7s. So outside of the radical, I have negative 6 from up above, in the problem above. And then I have a 7 from my pair of 7s. And then underneath, I have a 2, and I have a 5. So I go ahead and put my multiplication symbols in there. And negative 6 times 7 is negative 42. 2 times 5 is 10. So my final answer is negative 42 radical 10. And the last problem for you to try on your own from 6 and 7a is, let's do 2 radical 18 times negative 4 radical 27. And while you're trying that, you can think about our fun fact for the day. A goldfish has a memory span of 3 seconds. Hopefully your memory span is a little bit longer than that.